Welcome everyone to this HCA Healthcare podcast. My name is Brian Moran and I'm the Assistant Vice President of Pharmacy Operations. Today we'll be talking about the COVID-19 vaccine logistics, specifically about the unique challenges of the distribution model, including the unusual ultra-cold storage requirements and corresponding logistics. Today is January 12th, 2021. As we talk about the distribution model of the vaccine, I think it's really important to first understand globally how the vaccine distribution strategy was created. Going back to mid-2020, there has been a coordinated effort through Operation Warp Speed to prepare for vaccine deployment. As a background, Operation Warp Speed is a group of federal partners, including agencies such as HHS, FDA, CDC, Department of Defense, with the goal of mobilizing and delivering 300 million vaccines by January 2021. These federal partners have been coordinating closely throughout 2020 and now 2021 with private industry partners to accelerate the development, manufacturing, and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. These industry partners include a broad array of private companies ranging from pharmaceutical manufacturers, wholesale distributors, health systems like HCA, group purchasing organizations, and others. We were fortunate to be able to participate and contribute as a company to a number of those work streams. I won't go into detail of all of the work Operation Warp Speed has done, but there are a couple of key foundational decisions that they and federal leadership made early on that had major ramifications on the distribution model of the vaccine. The first, and I would argue most meaningful, was a decision to allow each state and local jurisdiction to determine their own local distribution plan. What this means is that federally, they would determine how vaccines are allocated to the states, but once the vaccine is in the state, that state then has the authority and autonomy to allocate vaccine to providers in any way they desire, and also create any additional requirements for provider eligibility. Each provider location wishing to receive and administer vaccine has to work with that local jurisdiction, follow their processes in order to get registered. Each state and jurisdiction has then defined their own processes for things like communication with their provider locations, the method for how vaccines will be allocated each week, and also how vaccines are ordered and replenished. Although Operation Warp Speed provided an abundance of guidance to the state, we have seen variability from states and how they decided to deploy their vaccines initially, as well as subsequently first and second doses. As we have entered 2021, this variability and changes to the distribution strategy continue to happen day to day. A recent example of this is how first dose vaccines were distributed compared to second. The original guidance from Operation Warp Speed was that first and second doses would be managed separately, which is consistent with how most states handled it initially. This meant that if a hospital received a shipment of first dose vaccines, then they would automatically receive the second dose vaccines 3 to 4 weeks later, depending on which vaccine. What this allowed for was a confidence to utilize the initial doses without fear that you would not have the second doses when you need them. To do this, though, the government actually withheld doses from distribution to ensure that the need would be met. As recently as this week, however, the stance has begun to change as both states and federal government are trying to find ways to accelerate vaccination. As a result, it appears likely that instead of first and separate doses being kept separate, instead all doses are going to end up being released simultaneously. This change will certainly get more vaccines into the community, which is great. In this new model, the provider entity will have to be very, very careful in tracking how they're scheduling patients to ensure that the supply that they have is adequate to continue to vaccinate new patients while also maintaining adequate supply for planned second doses to complete their treatment. Setting aside some of the variability, one area that I would highlight, in addition to the vaccine distribution, has been distribution of ancillary supplies for vaccination. I think something really smart that Operation Warp Speed did is that whenever they ship vaccine, they're actually sending kits that contain all of the key supplies for vaccination. These kits include things like vaccination cards, needles and syringes, surgical masks, etc. This has really helped in making it be one less thing that we as providers have to worry about because it's helped facilitate care that when we get vaccines, we're prepared to quickly administer them. As we talk about vaccine distribution, one last area that I'd like to highlight is security. Federally, at a state level, and within our organization, we are very concerned with the security of COVID-19 vaccine. In fact, in the lead up to the first doses being distributed, Interpol actually issued a warning that they were anticipating organized crime activity related to COVID-19 vaccines. As a result, we have instituted a variety of internal controls to monitor our supply, to monitor our chain of custody, and keep track of how vaccines are moving, as well as the security throughout our vaccine receipt, vaccine storage, and our administration processes. At times, these controls have added time, but we feel that it's critically important to ensure security and integrity of vaccine supply. You may have seen in the news recently that unfortunately there was a pharmacist where they actually intentionally took vaccine from a freezer, put it into room temperature, which then caused that vaccine to spoil. And then a number of patients ended up being exposed to that vaccine. And then subsequently, they had to dispose of a large quantity of vaccine. This is exactly the kind of thing that we're hoping to prevent with some of these controls so that we know that the vaccine supply that we have is as effective as possible and that it's not, walking out our doors and being diverted to who knows where. With all that kind of said, I'd like to transition away now from how we're getting vaccines and the vaccine distribution processes, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how vaccines are stored. As you may have heard, these vaccines are unusual in their extreme storage requirements. Since the start of the pandemic, there have been a number of vaccines candidates being studied for FDA emergency use authorization. Each vaccine has a different dose schedule, different manufacturing method, and different storage requirements. 2020, staying very on brand, the two most difficult vaccines for storage and logistics were, of course, the first two to be approved for emergency use authorization. The Pfizer vaccine in particular, you may have heard a lot about. This vaccine is unique in its need for ultra-cold storage, and that is not an understatement. In order to store this vaccine beyond 5 days, it has to be kept frozen at a temperature between negative 60 degrees Celsius and negative 80 degrees Celsius. As you can imagine, these sorts of temperatures are not reachable by a conventional freezer. They in fact require specialty freezers that normally are reserved for things like tissue or stem cells. This makes vaccine deployment unusually difficult because not all hospitals have these freezers, and they certainly are not present in other less acute sites of care, like, say, for example, a physician office. So, one thing I'd mention, along this line about the ultra cold storage is that one of the most unique aspects has actually been the transport of the vaccine. I actually give a lot of credit to both Operation Warp Speed as well as Pfizer in the work that they did to allow for safe transport of the Pfizer vaccine. The way it kind of works is that every Pfizer shipment is actually delivered in a special shipping container that is packed with 50 pounds of pelletized dry ice and includes continuous monitoring that is tracked throughout the entire shipping process. The shipping container, pretty interestingly, can also ultimately be used as the storage device once it's received at a hospital or other location. To do this, however, can be a little bit challenging. To maintain these ultra cold temperatures, the pharmacy department, or whoever's received the vaccine, has to actually replenish the dry ice within 24 hours of receipt of the vaccine, and then every 5 days thereafter. So then storing vaccine in this way, however, does allow for a hospital to store the vaccine frozen for up to 30 days. This storage capability was key in Operation Warp Speed's plans to allow for broad distribution of the Pfizer vaccine because it allowed for hospitals, even without special ultra-cold storage freezers, to store vaccine more than long enough to allow for vaccination. Once thawed, so once you're out of frozen storage, Pfizer's vaccine can be stored for up to 5 days at refrigeration. This allows for some amount of flexibility to then redistribute the vaccine to other, say, remote administration locations, which is something that we have done a lot within HCA Healthcare, where we get, kind of what I would say, hub and spoke model, where we send vaccine to one location, stored in an ultra cold fashion, and then ship smaller allotments to other hospitals or other clinics to then allow for vaccination to occur more broadly. Separate from the Pfizer vaccine is the Moderna vaccine, which was the second vaccine approved. Fortunately, this vaccine is much easier when it comes to the logistics. The Moderna vaccine requires freezer temperatures similar to the Pfizer vaccine, but it only requires temperatures of negative 20 degrees Celsius for long-term storage. It also has much more favorable stability when it comes to refrigeration, in that you actually get 30 days of stability once it's in a refrigerator. So this just allows for a lot easier utilization and storage of the vaccine. As a result, we see a number of states decide to send Pfizer vaccine only to hospitals with ultra cold freezers and then send Moderna to everybody else. This is positive in the sense that it's a lot easier to manage. It's a lot easier to manage for the people who are getting the vaccine. And in some ways, it's even, I think, easier to manage for the states as they're allocating it out. That said, Moderna supply alone isn't necessarily enough to take care of all of those stakeholders. As a result, we see in some degree of inequitable distribution of vaccine in some states and municipalities, which is something that you could be hearing about. If you're to watch the news, read the newspaper, you may hear how some hospitals, are vaccinating all sorts of patient populations, because they may have been over-allocated vaccine. And so because of the short stability, we're really rushing to administer it to anybody who they could get it to, while others are still in some of the earlier tiers of vaccination. So kind of adding all these factors up, result in what I would say is one of the most unique and challenging distribution programs that frankly we've ever had to deal with. And, as we go towards the future, it's likely that that's going to continue to be pretty complex. We currently are dealing with 2 vaccines. We're likely to get a third and a fourth here in the first quarter of 2021, which is great. Again, each of those is going to be slightly different in how they're administered, what the dosage is, how they're going to be stored. They likely will be a little bit easier, which is really good news, but this continues to just be somewhat of a moving target as states and our federal partners continue to kind of try to push for more vaccination, which is great, but also are somewhat changing expectations on the fly in day to day. So as a result, this has caused our hospitals to have to be very adaptable and nimble in reacting as these processes and expectations continue to just shift basically day to day. So that all said, I just want to say that I continue to be personally humbled by this flexibility and ingenuity of our providers and our hospitals. The vaccine logistics have prevented a number of challenges, but every single time our doctors, nurses, pharmacists, hospitals have rallied together to help ensure we get our employees and our patients protected by this vaccine, which I think is incredible. Plans are going to continue to change as we go through this upcoming administration change that's coming here very shortly, as well as the pandemic just continues to challenge us from a resource perspective. I know that all of you that are listening will do an exceptional job in managing this and adapting to it. And with that, I just want to say a thank you for all of what you do. It's sincerely appreciated. And with that, I would like to conclude this podcast. Thank you so much.